Thank you, Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Feinstein, and members of the committee who hopefully are watching from a remote location somewhere. My intention today is to focus on the millions of children who are caught in the horrific web of child trafficking, of human trafficking. Many of these children are sexually exploited as subjects of child pornography and as victims of rape for money here in the United States. My desire is that their plight is heard and understood better today. Any conclusions I offer are based on real child trafficking cases that I worked on directly over the past 17 years. I started my career in the CIA. Then for 12 years, I worked as a special agent and undercover operator for Homeland Security investigations. 10 of those years, I worked combating sex trafficking along the southern border. For the last 5 years, as Chairman Graham mentioned, I served as the founder and CEO of the anti-trafficking organization Operation Underground Railroad, working hand in hand with law enforcement in 20 countries, including 22 states in this country. Operation Underground Railroad has rescued over 2,000 victims and assisted in the arrest of over 1,000 traffickers and pedophiles. Much of my work has been based on simple economics. The United States is one of the highest, if not the highest, consumers of child pornography in the world. We are the demand for child sex. As such, traffickers around the world seek to bring children to the United States where they can sell them for sex and make a lot of money. My number one personal and professional goal has been to keep these children out of the hands of these sick American pedophiles. I want to share one case in which we failed to do this. The victim was a foreign-born child around 12 years old, who we will call Lily. Lily was kidnapped south of the border. She was then taken along with several other children her age and smuggled into the United States, not through a port of entry, but rather through a part of the southern border without significant barriers or a wall. Lily's traffickers easily transported her to New York City, where she was raped between 30 and 40 times a day, and this is not atypical at all for a case like this. She believes that she alone was raped over 20,000 times between the age of 13 and 17 right here in our country. She eventually escaped, and my foundation is now caring for her as she prepares to testify in federal court against her captors. In accordance with U.S. laws, Lily, as a survivor of sex trafficking, she has been granted legal status, and we're helping her to complete the process of becoming a U.S. citizen. The U.S. Attorney's Office has requested that we not publicly share any more details about this case, as it's going to trial later this year. Recounting her experience, and this is key, Lily has often asked me a simple yet powerful question. Why was there no wall or barrier on the southern border for me? A barrier would have saved me. What is she talking about? It's pretty simple what she's talking about. During a time of crisis or emergency, each of us knows to call 911 because 911 bridges the gap between bad guys trying to hurt us and the good guys coming to help us. Lily knows that strong barriers would have likely forced her captors to take their chances at a port of entry, thus placing her face-to-face with well-equipped and well-trained officers who are looking for her, looking for children who are being trafficked. I would have yelled out to one of them, Lily told me regretfully. Instead, I was raped over 20,000 times. Contrast that case with another case I was the lead agent on. The trafficker was an American named Earl Buchanan. He kept children, both little boys and girls, in San Bernardino, California, where he lived, and where he repeatedly raped them and filmed it for his child pornography collection. On the night of July 3rd, 2006, Buchanan was attempting to smuggle a 5-year-old Mexican boy through the Calexico, California port of entry. Fortunately for the boy, he was coming from the Mexicali, Mexico region, which is blocked by miles and miles of significant border barriers. This compelled Buchanan to take his chances at the Calexico port of entry, where a U.S. officer had the opportunity to look Buchanan in the eye, detect that something was wrong, identify the child locked in the van, liberate that child, arrest Buchanan, who is now spending the rest of his life in jail. Subsequent to that arrest, almost a dozen other children, many undocumented migrant children, were rescued and liberated. As I compare these two cases and dozens just like them that I worked personally as a federal agent, and I've submitted examples of these in my full written testimony, my conclusion is that we have a much greater chance of catching human traffickers and liberating their victims at a port of entry than we do where there is no barrier. I've been quite surprised of late to see politicians and others who are opposed to building barriers and walls hail the successes of drug seizures and rescues at ports of entry and using those successes to say, see, we don't need walls or barriers, we have ports of entry. The bad guys come through ports of entry. In fact, we don't have ports of entry without walls. The walls are the thing that compelled Buchanan to take that child into the port of entry in the first place. From his vantage point on the night of July 3rd, 2006, with this poor slave child captive in his van, he only had one choice, the port of entry. And that was thanks to the border wall that existed where he happened to be working his evil works. Currently, with hundreds of miles of border, too many traffickers have a choice. Sadly, we as a nation are providing them that choice. In the end, the boy was liberated and Buchanan was locked up. In Lily's case, the traffickers were liberated and she was locked up and raped thousands of times in New York City. The difference? The boy had a barrier to save him. Lily did not. Paola Felix is a former Mexican congresswoman and current senior Mexican administration official working on anti-trafficking policies for Mexican President Manuel López Obrador. I work very closely with Paola to find children in Mexico who are en route to being smuggled into the United States. Responding to the debate over border barriers, Felix declared, quote, "It is very disappointing to me that people in the United States would ignore or downplay the many Hispanic children being smuggled into the United States outside of legal ports of entry and forced into the hell of sex slavery. Mexican authorities have uncovered at least 19 different land-based smuggling routes where victims are taken and trafficked for sex in the United States. Downplaying the crisis discourages U.S. officials from employing every tactic available to rescue them during the small window of time that they can. That is, while they are being crossed into the United States. After that, they are gone, maybe forever." End quote. As I conclude my remarks, please join me in a mental exercise that I employ often to ground me and focus me. I imagine that one of my own children is in the place of one of these child victims. I have 9 children, including 2 that my wife and I recently adopted from Haiti after having liberated them from traffickers. So it's something easier for me to do, and I know it's a difficult thing to do, but please, just for a moment, please imagine that one of your children, your grandchildren, nieces, nephews, dear friends has been kidnapped and is currently in Mexico being transported north with an evil scheme to smuggle them into the United States and force them into these black markets that we are discussing. We don't know exactly how the traffickers plan to get your child in this hypothetical. That's up to them and only known by them. But I think it's important to remember the stats that we heard earlier today that upwards of 90% of the children, including the unaccompanied minors, are coming around the ports of entry in barrier-less parts of the border. But in this hypothetical, they're coming in. We don't know where, but they are coming. And in this hypothetical, before you sits a button that, if pushed, instantly creates a large and powerful barrier along the entire southern border. Now picture the hundreds of miles of border that exist, and picture those ports of entry with hundreds of agents, trained, equipped, looking for your child, trained to look for your child, who hopefully is coming through. And so now the question, do you push the button? If the answer is yes to that, then it's very clear what needs to be done next in our country. These children, the real children, have nobody. I know, I've seen them. I've seen dozens of them. They have nobody. The only adults in their lives want to sell them, traffic them, and rape them. And so we must run to them. We must be their parents. If not us, who? If not this esteemed committee with the power and authority to rescue lives, if not you, then I ask, who? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Ballard, the essence of your testimony is that human trafficking basically is conducted outside of ports of entry.
There's cases also where it's at the ports of entry, and certainly, even though I discussed one success there, but yes, the majority of the kids and the statistics back that are coming outside the ports of entry. That's what the cartels are choosing to take them.
Right. So walls would drive them to the ports of entry, is your point?
Absolutely.
And we may miss some there, but the best chance of helping these kids is to funnel this terrible practice into ports of entry.
The best chance by far.
And is that widely shared in your profession of trying to help children from human trafficking?
It absolutely is.
Okay. What percentage do you think of children brought into the country for exploitation come across the southern border?
You know, it's hard to say the numbers. I mean, we know about 17,000 women and children are brought into the United States for the purpose of sex. It's hard to know where. If we knew the number, we'd go get them, right? So it's difficult to know. But we have
I don't
these
know
cases
if it's coming through airplanes or but you do know they do cross the southern border.
Absolutely, we know that.
Okay.
Mr. Ballard, you have 9 children. My grandmother had 11, so
Oh, really?
I know the range. Congratulations.
Thank you.
The American Academy of Pediatrics has described very egregious conditions for children in CBP processing facilities, including lack of bedding, constant light exposure, and cold temperature. Have you visited any of these detention facilities?
I have not visited them, no.
Well, do you agree with the pediatric group's finding that conditions in these facilities are inadequate?
Everything I do is based through children, through the eyes of children, and I agree with what Dr. Linton is saying, that needs to be the number one priority, absolutely, and more needs to go into making sure these kids have what they need to have.
Mr. Ballard, you've gotten some questions about inhumane treatment of children who are being trafficked across international boundaries. Inhumane treatment, regrettably, as has been alleged against our own government. Tell me about the type of inhumane conditions you've observed from those who have been involved in child sex trafficking. Are they subjected to inhumane treatment?
Absolutely. The worst scenarios you could dream up. That's what they've been involved in. Not only during the New York Times, in fact, Senator Harris pointed out, the New York Times just this week talked about 100 different cases of women, children who were being brought in by the cartels at first to smuggle them. But then, remember, that cartel is in charge, and they can switch and say, now it's a trafficking. I'm going to traffic you. I can make more money if I just keep you. And they start raping these children and these women, tying them up, binding their hands, duct tape. The New York Times reported this week.
They're paying with their bodies.
They're paying with their bodies, and exactly. And then beyond that, they end up in our big cities. There's been very successful prosecutions just this year in sentencing in Atlanta and New York. These Mexican human trafficking cartels who are taking children like Liliana and selling them in Atlanta, New York City, Phoenix, Los Angeles, selling them where they're being raped 20, 30,000 times, over a 5-year, 6-year span.
So these children are separated from their parents?
Yes, they are.
These children are subjected to confined, uncomfortable, and horrific living conditions.
Absolutely.
These children are subjected to cold temperatures.
Yes.
These children are subjected to every conceivable horror known to humankind.
Absolutely, they are.
And U.S. policy is facilitating and even encouraging it, is it not?
Unfortunately, I think it is.
We heard from Mr. McAleenan earlier today that in the last 10 months alone, there have been 1,700 known instances of an adult traveling north from our southern border into the United States, claiming falsely to be a parent or family member of the child.
Yes.
Would you estimate that to be on the low end of the actual numbers that are occurring?
Oh, no, I think that's the low end for sure. In the last 2 years, it's increased 360%, the adults who come in with kids who aren't their kids. And there's been some assumptions, I think, that need to be dispelled. I've heard today about that parents are sending their kids. That's not necessarily the case. I have information about kids being kidnapped and used as pawns to be their get-out-of-jail-free card, as Senator Cruz pointed out, to get in and say, look, I can claim asylum now. So these kids are being utilized. Frankly, and this is sad, the best case is that they're just being utilized so someone can get in and stay in. But I fear that once they're there, once they're already vulnerable, now there's a very profitable market in child sex in this country. Now where else are they going to be taken? So I'm very concerned about. There's more than 10,000 unaccompanied minors currently in custody. Currently in the care or custody of the United States government. I'm very worried about those. I'm worried also, Senator, about certain protections in an effort to give protections to those who would claim, I'm a sponsor of this kid, I'm the kid's parent. And we want to protect those to facilitate the process of reuniting families. But please, let's put measures in place to have identity hearings or whatever is required to make sure that those kids are going back to parents and not back to their traffickers. I work operations in 20 countries, and I can tell you that when we save these kids and we take them to rehabilitation centers, we have them under lock and key. We have guards, armed guards to protect them because their traffickers come looking for their property. Oh, I can give you countless cases of this. So let's not let that happen in this country.
Slavery exists today, according to what you're saying.
Yes, sir.
Does it exist to the same degree as it existed in prior centuries?
Actually, the numbers, and again, not to downplay at all that horrible blight, the transatlantic slave trade at all. There's nothing worse than that. But in terms of numbers, there are more people in slavery today than ever before in the history of the world. In fact, you could add up all the people that were enslaved during the transatlantic slave period, the 300, 400-year period of the transatlantic slave trade, and there's more people alive in slavery today than all of those combined. And these are people who don't control their body, whether it's sex, labor, or organ harvesting, which we work all of those cases.
You've been involved in liberating those who are held captive as sex slaves.
Yes.
Have you worked with the Mexican government doing this?
I have, very
What
closely.
Can you tell us about your efforts with the Mexican government?
I work very closely with the Mexican government. We've done several operations. We're currently running operations, and our goal is to find these kids en route to the United States, to be there to kind of cut it off, a preventative strike, if you will. We've rescued over 50 children so far. But the problem, as I'm doing these operations, and I've served as the undercover operator in many of them, as we're doing these deals, it's like playing defense 3 on 1,000. You see this coming. It's like catching flies with chopsticks. You get some of them, but I'm in my mind, just so you know what I'm thinking as I'm doing these operations, forward deployed south of the border. I'm thinking, I wish to God I knew that there was, smart barriers, a full protective, game along the southern border, so that when I miss them, and we will miss them, they have one more chance. One more chance, one more window of opportunity that we might rescue them through that port of entry. And right now, that one more chance is not viable.
Would a border barrier help us save some children from the unmistakable, unspeakable horrors?
Absolutely it
of
would,
sex
because it
trafficking?
drives the traffic to the law enforcement officers, the brave men and women who are looking for those children.
Describe how that works. How does it drive them toward the law enforcement officers?
Because we've limited their options. Right now, the cartels are clearly choosing to take children around the ports of entry. We just heard the stats. Over 90% of the children are coming around. The cartels are choosing that route because it's better for them. Why are we giving them that chance? Don't give them that chance. Make them go to the port of entry and wall it off with technology, with barriers, whatever's required to force them to have their only choice can be the port of entry. That's the highest chance that we're going to rescue children. And rescuing children should be our number one priority.
As a former law enforcement officer and as an activist who's actively engaged in liberating people from sex trafficking, you are trained in being able to identify the signs of human trafficking. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And others, including people who protect our southern border, are trained in that as well.
That's correct.
So when they're at ports of entry, they can see when somebody exhibits the signs of either being trafficked or engaging in human trafficking.
Absolutely. I can give you a specific example of a CBP officer who saw the carotid artery popping on this guy and said, something's up with you. Boom, looks behind the van, there's a child back there. He opens up the van, takes out the child, and there's videos of child pornography of that little boy and that man abusing him. They got him. These are our trained CBP officers. They're brave men and women, and they're looking for those signs.
So if that individual who was trafficking that little boy had an easier chance to go through someplace else, someplace where there was no barrier, would they have found him?
Very difficult.
Been
Possible,
much
very, very difficult.
Much harder
Much more
to save that
difficult.
little boy.
That's correct.
Many of my colleagues have commented on the fact that barriers can sometimes be circumvented. People can sometimes go above it or below the barrier. What's your reaction to this?
That's correct. I've crawled through tunnels, multiple tunnels between Mexico and the United States. That's why these barriers need to be smart barriers. They need to include technology. There's ways to detect if there's tunnels below you using technology. There needs to be sensors, drones. It needs to be a full court press. If we can save just one kid from being raped 20,000 times, it's worth the full court press in my mind.
Particularly in certain areas. Some areas, there's a lot of traffic, but still no barrier. I'm thinking of parts of the lower Rio Grande Valley where there are a lot of miles of border with no barrier at all, where there's a lot of human trafficking going on.
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Ballard.
Thank you.